Chris Rock. The name alone carries a rhythm sharp, unfiltered, and unforgettable. A man who redefined comedy not by chasing cheap laughs, but by carving truth into punchlines. He was the voice of a generation too tired to cry and too proud to beg. A Brooklyn kid who learned to turn pain into poetry, silence into stage presence, and survival into art. From sold-out arenas to silent heartbreaks. Chris Rock's life isn't just a rise to fame, it's a study in endurance, in honesty, in finding light without pretending the darkness didn't exist. With 4 Emmys, 3 Grammys, and a voice that's echoed in every corner of American culture, Chris didn't just entertain. He exposed. He enlightened. He endured. But behind the spotlight and the standing ovations was a journey stitched together with wounds most never saw. Family losses, public betrayals, a 20-year marriage that quietly unraveled, and the pain of being a black man in spaces never meant to hold him. This is not just a story of a comedian. It's the story of a man who found a way to laugh through grief, love through loss, and stand tall in the face of fire. The story of a voice born in silence that never stopped speaking truth. And if his journey has ever made you laugh, reflect, or feel seen, then hit that like button. Because the greatest applause isn't for the loudest voice. It's for the most honest one. Chris Rock was born on February 7, 1965, in Andrews, South Carolina, but his story truly began in Brooklyn, New York, when he was still an infant. His parents, Julius and Rosalie Rock, packed up their hopes and moved north, chasing the American promise. What they found instead was a 2-bedroom apartment in Bedford-Stuyvesant, cramped, cold, and cracked at the edges. Outside, sirens replaced lullabies, and the walls rattled when winter wind howled through broken window frames. His father worked multiple jobs, truck driver by day, newspaper delivery man by dawn. His hands were stained with grease, his back bent by fatigue. Rosalie, a preschool teacher and part-time social worker, was the quiet anchor. At night, she'd sew torn clothes under a flickering bulb, while Julius counted coins at the table. Each clink echoed the fragile line between survival and hunger. They didn't speak much of dreams. They spoke of duty. Chris grew up with 6 siblings, the eldest of a stormy household, where laughter was rare, but resilience was law. The air inside their apartment smelled of metal and chalk, of boiled rice and old books. And yet, even in that narrow space, Chris Rock began building the wide world of his voice. At age 10. The city forced him into a desegregation busing program meant to equalize education, but in truth, it delivered cruelty. Each day he rode across Brooklyn into a school filled with white faces and closed hearts. The bullying was relentless spitballs in the hallway, fists in the locker room, words sharper than knives. Some days he tied his shoes so tight just to feel like something in his life was still holding together. He never told his parents. He carried those bruises like secrets, stuffed between homework pages and silent dinners. But in that silence, something powerful began to stir. Humor became a defense. Then it became art. Every insult became a lesson in timing. Every punchline, a way to steal back power. He didn't know it then, but the rhythm of pain was tuning his voice. And that voice, once taught by silence, would one day teach the world how to laugh and listen. But what began as defense would soon become destiny. By the time Chris Rock turned 18, he had already lived through more hardship than most men twice his age. But adulthood didn't greet him with opportunity. It greeted him with uncertainty. There were no scholarships waiting, no safety nets, only New York City's unrelenting pace and a dream too fragile to speak out loud. He worked odd jobs flipping burgers, bagging groceries, mopping floors, anything to make enough for the next day's meal or a ride to the comedy club. But the stage wasn't some polished escape. It was often a basement soaked in spilled beer, with broken mics and barely alert drunks nursing cheap whiskey in the front row. He wasn't welcome. Not really. Some nights the laughter never came. Some nights they booed, or worse, ignored him. He'd step off stage with humiliation dripping from his collar like sweat, wondering if the world even wanted what he had to offer. He was broke, truly broke. No apartment some months. No dinner others. There were nights he rode the subway until dawn just to stay warm. He'd scribble jokes into a battered notebook under dim, flickering train lights, the car rocking like a cradle for a child too old to dream. But still he came back. Night after night, bombing, learning, sharpening his rhythm. For him, laughter wasn't ambition. It was oxygen, survival, a way to keep the dark from swallowing him whole. And then, in 1986, the stars cracked open just enough to let in one ray of light. Eddie Murphy, already a legend, walked into a club where Chris was performing. He didn't see a polished act. He saw raw fire, the potential hidden beneath the nerves. The timing buried under hungered-out Murphy didn't walk away. He smiled, and in that moment, everything changed. He cast Chris in Beverly Hills Cop 2, a small role, barely a line. But it was the door, the first real check, the first proof that maybe, just maybe, his voice had value. Chris had walked through winters that nearly broke him, through nights that whispered, "You'll never make it." And now, for the first time, the silence whispered something else. Keep going. But while one door opened, Hollywood kept its heart locked. By 1990, Chris Rock had tasted the edge of opportunity. But that taste turned bitter when he stepped onto the legendary stage of Saturday Night Live. For many comedians, it was the dream. For Chris, it became a weekly war. Studio 8H was a battleground where airtime was a weapon and laughs were a lifeline. In that crowded, chaotic space of quick rewrites, nervous rehearsals, and unforgiving live cameras, Chris found himself struggling to fit in. The writers were mostly white. The jokes were tailored for middle America. And the spotlight that welcomed others barely glanced his way. He was the new kid, the outsider, the lone black man in sketches that often reduced him to background characters or stereotypes. Behind the scenes, he fought to make his voice heard in a room that didn't always want to listen. On air, he survived on scraps. A line here, a moment there, and always the pressure to deliver or disappear. He once said, "You either kill or you die." And every Saturday night felt like a funeral for a dream he hadn't yet lived. But it wasn't all failure. He forged bonds with other cast members, Adam Sandler, David Spade, Rob Schneider, and together they formed a quiet brotherhood, a crew of underdogs trying to write their names into history. They called themselves the Bad Boys of SNL. Still, by 1993, it was clear Chris Rock needed more than survival. He needed sovereignty. He walked away from the show that had both elevated and erased him, stepping back into the only place that had ever welcomed his truth. The stage. He hit the road again. Cheap clubs, motel rooms, microphones that buzzed like old light bulbs. But this time, he had experience. He had rage. And more importantly, he had something to prove. And from that silence came fire. When Chris Rock returned to the stage, it wasn't with a whisper, it was with a roar. In 1996, his HBO special Bring the Pain didn't just revive his career. It set it on fire. The jokes were sharper, the rhythm more precise, the truths harder to ignore. He didn't just tell jokes, he delivered sermons of survival, masked in punchline. Bring the Pain. Won him 2 Emmys, but more than awards, it earned him something far rarer in comedy reverence. He wasn't the funny guy anymore. He was the voice of hard truths, a stand-up philosopher dissecting race, class, relationships, and America's fractured identity, all while making people laugh until their ribs ached. That special kicked off a string of hits, Bigger and Blacker in 1999, Never Scared in 2004, and Kill the Messenger in 2008. Each performance deeper, more unapologetic, more surgical in its takedown of hypocrisy and injustice. Chris had found his groove. But what the world didn't see was the cost. Behind the laughter was a man burning the candle from both ends. He was touring constantly hundreds of shows a year, living in hotel rooms, eating standing up, flying alone. The applause never stopped, but neither did the exhaustion. Laughter had become a form of oxygen and withdrawal. From It Felt Like Death. In 1997, he launched The Chris Rock Show on HEO. This wasn't just comedy. It was cultural commentary with teeth. He grilled celebrities, politicians, and icons with the same fearlessness he brought to the stage. The show earned him another Emmy, but more importantly, it positioned him as one of the most intelligent voices in America. Then came Everybody Hates Chris, the semi-autobiographical sitcom that aired from 2005 to 2009. Based on his teenage years, the show turned trauma into comedy. It captured the essence of poverty, race, and adolescence with warmth, wit, and clarity. Millions laughed, but few understood how close it cut to the bone. Comedy, Chris once said, is how I survived. And with Everybody Hates Chris, he offered the world a survival guide dressed in sitcom clothes. But even as his star rose higher, the toll became heavier. The world cheered his fearlessness. But Chris Rock was no longer performing to be seen. He was performing to remember, to process, to heal. But behind the spotlight came deeper shadows. When Chris Rock returned to the stage after leaving SNL, he didn't just come back hungry. He came back transformed. In 1996, his HBO special Bring the Pain didn't just mark his return. It detonated a cultural bomb. This wasn't the same comic from dingy clubs and awkward sketches. This was a man with something to say and a sharpened skill to say it. He tackled race, relationships, and hypocrisy with fearless clarity. He didn't tiptoe around hard truths. He sprinted through them. Bring the Pain won 2 Emmys and elevated Rock to the top tier of American comedy. But more than fame, it gave him a new kind of power, the ability to turn trauma into truth, and truth into art. He followed it with Bigger and Blacker, 1999, Never Scared, 2004, and Kill the Messenger, 2008. Each one a masterclass in turning lived experience into laughter. His comedy was no longer about getting laughs. It was about telling the truth and making the world listen. But with every standing ovation came another cost. Chris was touring nonstop. Hotels replaced homes. Stages replaced sleep. And the silence after the shows, those long, lonely nights, began to echo louder than the applause. He was burning out, but too driven to stop. Laughter was how I stayed alive, he once admitted. But survival came with scars. His HBO series, The Chris Rock Show, 1997 to 2000, gave him another outlet. With sharp interviews and political satire, it earned critical acclaim and further cemented his place as a cultural force. But it was Everybody Hates Chris, 2005 to 2009, his semi-autobiographical sitcom, that pulled back the curtain. Based on his childhood, the show made millions laugh, but for Chris, it was a form of therapy. A retelling of bruises and bullies, parents and poverty, all repackaged into sitcom gold. Still, the success didn't make the shadows go away. If anything, it cast them longer. The more the world cheered, the more Chris retreated inward. Because beneath every punchline was a man still trying to make sense of his own pain and use it to help others do the same. And while the world laughed louder. The man behind the mic grew quieter. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. March 27th, 2022, the Academy Awards. The Dolby Theater glowed with Hollywood perfection gowns, cameras, applause, and on stage stood Chris Rock, doing what he did best, making people laugh with a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. One line, one joke, a small jab at Jada Pinkett Smith. The audience chuckled, but the air shifted. From the crowd, Will Smith stood, calm at first, then walking faster. Chris smiled, still thinking it was part of the show. But then impact. Will's open hand struck Chris across the face. A sound louder than laughter. A silence louder than sound. The entire world froze. Chris didn't retaliate. He didn't yell. He didn't flinch. He stood still, blinking. Composed, stunned, but still standing. "Wow," he said quietly. Will Smith just slapped the SH, and then paused. The show continued. But nothing was the same. In an age of viral outrage, the clip looped endlessly. Opinions flew from every direction. Some defended Will, citing love and boundaries. Others called it assault in front of millions. But through it all, Chris Rock said nothing. Not a tweet. Not an interview. Not a podcast appearance. Just silence. That silence wasn't weakness. It was wisdom, control, discipline honed over a lifetime of learning when to speak and when to endure. It wasn't until 2023, almost a full year later, that he responded. And even then, it wasn't a press release. It was art. His Netflix Live special selective outrage turned that night into something else entirely. Not revenge. Not bitterness. Something more powerful: truth. Through precise storytelling, sharp humor, and restraint, he dissected what happened, not with cruelty, but with clarity. He didn't attack Will Smith. He elevated himself. He admitted the hurt, the humiliation. He made the world laugh, but more than that, he made it reflect. "I'm not a victim," he said. "I would never let someone define me like that." It wasn't about slapping back. It was about reclaiming his story. On his terms. In that moment, Chris Rock reminded the world of something more powerful than fame. Grace under fire. Dignity when humiliated. Composure when chaos calls your name. Because some men strike back with fists. Others with truth. Behind every sharp joke and sold-out show, there was a quieter story playing out in Chris Rock's life. A story of loss. Not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that reshapes a man without warning. In 1988, just as Chris's career was starting to flicker, his father, Julius Rock, went into the hospital for what was supposed to be a routine surgery to treat an ulcer. But life is rarely routine. Julius died suddenly. No farewell. No last conversation. Just silence. For Chris, that silence was unbearable. The man who had worked through rain, through pain, through exhaustion to keep the family alive, was simply gone. Julius had raised his kids with grit, not words. His love wasn't soft. It was in the way he delivered newspapers at dawn and fixed brakes with tired hands. Chris had dreamed of making it big so he could finally repay his father. But Julius never got to see it. That ache never left him. Then came 2006, another phone call, another silence. Chris's half-brother, Charles L. Rock, lost his battle with addiction. He died quietly, a victim of alcoholism, in a world that barely noticed. Charles wasn't famous. He didn't chase fame, but he was family. A brother whose pain ran deep, who carried his battles behind closed doors. Chris didn't mourn him on stage. He mourned him in the silence between shows, in the way grief turns into reflection. And before that, in 1997, came the kind of loss that every comedian fears: Chris Farley. The wildest, kindest, most chaotic soul at Saturday Night Live. Chris Rock and Chris Farley had been part of the same brotherhood. The bad boys of SNL. Farley's energy was explosive, his heart even bigger. But behind that laughter was a man drowning in expectations and addiction. When Farley died of an overdose at 33, it hit Rock like a punch he couldn't dodge. "He was the funniest man I ever knew," Rock would say years later, "and maybe the saddest." And then came Bernie Mac in 2008, Chris's big brother in comedy. A man whose presence was like thunder, wrapped in velvet, powerful, soulful, grounded. They'd worked together on films like Head of State and The Longest Yard. Bernie's death from pneumonia complications at 50 wasn't sudden, but it was just as cruel. It felt like losing the last connection to a comedy era rooted in pride, dignity, and truth. "We didn't just lose Bernie," Chris once said, voice trembling. "We lost a giant." These weren't just personal losses. They were soul-level cracks. Every man gone left a different kind of silence. Julius taught him strength. Charles reminded him how quiet pain can destroy. Farley showed that joy doesn't always save you. Bernie reminded him what legacy should feel like. And so, his jokes changed. The pauses got longer. The laughs were still loud, but the spaces between them, they were full of ghosts. Grief didn't make Chris Rock weaker. It made him deeper. Every time he stepped on stage, he wasn't just performing. He was remembering, honoring, processing, because some people are mourned in eulogies. Others are mourned in punchlines that carry a whisper of who they were. And for Chris Rock, the silence they left behind became the rhythm beneath every laugh. Before the fame consumed every minute, before the world watched his every move, there was a woman named Malak. It was 1994 in New York City. Chris Rock had finally caught the industry's eye, but in the chaos of rising stardom, he found something he never expected: stillness. Malak Compton wasn't chasing the spotlight. She had her own mission: public relations, humanitarian work, a quiet strength that moved with purpose. And when she looked at him, she didn't see a future star. She saw the man beneath the noise. They fell into rhythm like a jazz melody, unexpected but smooth. Their love wasn't fireworks. It was warmth. Phone calls at midnight. Shared silence in the back of taxis. Coffee and laughter that didn't need an audience. For Chris, a man raised in noise and pressure, Malak was peace. In a world built on applause, he once said, "She was silence, and that silence saved me." They married in 1996, and for a while, it seemed like they'd defied the curse of celebrity love. Their home in Alpine, New Jersey, wasn't just a house, it was a refuge. Their daughters, Lola Simone and Zara Savannah, were born in 2002 and 2004, and Chris found a joy he never imagined: being a father. Mornings filled with pancakes, afternoons pushing strollers through Central Park, and nights falling asleep to the sound of his daughter's breathing. Fame felt distant in those moments. He finally had something real. But success is a jealous companion. The tours got longer, the hotels more frequent, the applause louder, and slowly, almost invisibly, the stillness began to erode. They stopped laughing in the kitchen. Conversations turned into calendar check-ins. Intimacy became routine, and silence, once sacred, became something colder, something that divided instead of healed. Chris began to drift. He later admitted to affairs, to arrogance, to letting ego grow louder than love. "I wasn't a good husband," he confessed during Tambourine. "That's nobody's fault but mine." He had used comedy as a shield for so long that he forgot how to take it off at home. And by the time he tried to fix it, Malak had grown quiet, not out of hate, but out of heartbreak. They separated in 2014, divorced in 2016. They Prenup had expired. The financial settlement was sealed. But the real cost wasn't money. It was memory. It was the ache of walking past rooms once filled with laughter. The echo of small footsteps in a house now too quiet. Yet even in their separation, they chose grace. There were no ugly interviews. No courtroom drama. They co-parented. They lived only miles apart. Chris stayed involved in his daughter's live school drop-offs, recitals, birthday calls. Being a dad isn't about weekends, he once said. It's about showing up. And through that long road of therapy, of accountability, of quiet redemption, Chris Rock discovered a truth deeper than comedy, that love, even when broken, still deserves respect. That real healing begins not with punchlines, but with presence. Because sometimes, the hardest lessons come not from losing love, but from learning what it needed in the first place. In a world that worships speed, applause, and reinvention, Chris Rock did something radical. He slowed down. By the time he reached his 50s, the roar of the crowd no longer filled him the way it used to. The stage, once a battlefield, became something gentler, a place of reflection. Not just performance. In 2020, he was diagnosed with nonverbal learning disorder, NVLD, a neurological condition that affects social perception and communication. For a man whose entire life had been about reading the room, the revelation hit like a curveball. But Chris didn't hide it. He embraced it. "I used to think I was just bad at people," he said. "Turns out I'm neurologically bad at people." And somehow, that honesty made him more human, more relatable, more powerful. Therapy became not just a process, but a practice. Chris dove deep 5 sessions a week, at one point unraveling decades of trauma, silence, and emotional blind spots. "You don't fix yourself once," he said. "You keep learning to listen." For the first time in his life, he stopped talking to be heard and started talking to be understood. The pandemic in 2021 brought more stillness. He caught COVID. It was mild, but it reminded him that control is an illusion. "You think you're running the show," he said. "Then something invisible knocks you on your ass." He emerged quieter, softer, grateful. Today, Chris Rock lives a life far removed from the chaos of early fame. His mornings begin with meditation, not scripts. Walks through Alpine, New Jersey. Cooking for himself. Calling his daughters Lola, now studying in Paris, and Zara, following in her mother's humanitarian footsteps. Their voices are his grounding force. "They're the only standing ovations that still matter," he says. He still performs, but not for relevance. For truth. In 2024, he returned with Everybody Still Hates Chris, an animated reboot of his iconic sitcom. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was healing. A way to revisit the past with the wisdom of age. He's also working on his most personal film project, yet as actor and director. Those close to him say it's intimate, fearless, and reflective. Just like him, his legacy isn't just comedy anymore. It's courage. It's confession. It's growth. The Rolls-Royce in his garage, the awards on his shelves, the millions in the bank, none of it defines him now. What does? Stillness, honesty, peace, because the man who once fought the world for a voice now uses that voice to say the quietest thing of all, "I'm okay." You don't retire from truth. You just find quieter ways to live inside it. Chris Rock's life wasn't built on punchlines. It was built on survival. From the bruises of Brooklyn hallways to the bright lights of the Oscars, from fatherless pain to fatherhood's quiet redemption, he has walked through fire again and again. And each time, he didn't just survive it. He shaped it into something the world could feel. He turned silence into rhythm, trauma into legacy, loss into laughter. And now at 60, he stands not as a man chasing fame, but as one who has found peace in finally knowing himself. The boy who once rode city buses to schools that didn't want him is now one of the most respected voices in comedy. The man who once bombed on basement stages now sells out global tours. The husband who failed has become the father who stays. And the comedian who once hid behind jokes now tells them to heal, not to escape. Chris Rock is no longer just a comic. He's a mirror, a man whose story reflects the truth that life isn't about perfection, it's about growth. We stumble, we fail, we break, but we also learn. We rebuild, we forgive, and we keep showing up. So when the applause fades, when the headlines vanish, when the mic goes quiet, there will still be a house in New Jersey. And inside it, 2 daughters who know their father not by the specials he wrote or the fame he earned, but by the mornings he showed up, the nights he listened, the love he gave, even after getting it wrong. That's the real punchline. Not the laugh, but the lesson. Because in the end, greatness isn't about never falling. It's about choosing to stand up again and again with love, with honesty, and with the courage to become better. And maybe, just maybe, the most powerful sound Chris Rock ever gave us wasn't a joke. It was silence that taught the world how to feel.